Encounter Talks with Dawn at Gessner Ministries, a forum for discussing challenging topics, dissecting truth, discovering hope and light in a world that desperately needs revival.
Wes, you threw me off on your title this week for your sermon. I thought, are you ready? Is he preaching on the second coming? And then when I listened, I realized that wasn't it. But
well, could have easily gone there, but I'm not.
Yeah.
I got burnt a little in the 70s, having that experience of thinking that the world was going to all come to an end within the next year or two. So I'm a little careful about putting that out.
You mean like 88 Reasons Why? You remember?
Oh, that was in 88. I'm talking back in the 70s, growing up in high school and being convinced that I would never, ever be able to even finish high school because the Lord was coming back.
And you come home quickly to see if your mom and dad were still there?
Oh, absolutely. If you get lost in the grocery store, you panic.
Yeah.
So I believe certainly in the second coming of the Lord, and I think it could happen anytime, and it could be a long time. Who knows?
Absolutely, that's for sure. Well, when I listened to the message, though, it was really good stuff, and I was excited to have a little bit of a conversation with you. I do want to talk about one area, and it is like off the rails. It's hardly got a thing to do with the subject, except it kind of led my mind down a different path, and I just want to touch on it for fun. But nevertheless, so I know that a lot of the message for me was about suffering in many ways, because when we suffer, we hope that we are becoming better people, and that should always be the case. I know that for myself, or probably for most people, don't we go through life thinking, man, I'd like to be this way or that way, but we forget about what it takes to become that person, or to be able to achieve that experience. So there's that aspect of it. There's a cost involved. But I know that isn't exactly what you were talking about. I know point one was about we should expect trials and tribulations, I guess, in our lifetime. And the part that was intriguing to me, and let me jump off the rails just early on, just for a few moments about this.
I'm waiting.
Because you talked about whatever you were reflecting on, you were talking about perhaps the contemporary church. And you said about the traditional church, but the one line you said in there was, probably the contemporary church is more effective, and perhaps the traditional was. I thought you.
I didn't exactly say that, but okay.
Well, let me just indulge it, because here's where my mind went. It went to this point. It was that it would be easy to think, because I think it happens all the time, that to be relevant, you have to be contemporary. That's sort of a default response a lot of the times. And when I thought about that, I thought, you know what? I'm not sure that either one of them perhaps are relevant.
And that was the point.
And that's a little bit harsh, because the truth is, when you think of the contemporary, we're really on the cutting edge, and we're cool and all of that. But are we really making disciples anyway? Even when we think of what it is in the contemporary, we're reaching more people, perhaps. But what is the end product?
Well, you and I have both been down that trail together in a church that didn't have any shortage of people coming and growing, and growth was steady. But what happens is you really begin to realize, and I can tell you that I never cut the message, I never compromised the message, I never softened the message, I never watered down the message. But people, so let's just do the contemporary church first. People have a high tolerance for not letting much affect them except the world. And so you can preach your heart out. They get 30 minutes of music, they get 30 minutes of preaching, they wipe a tear from their eye, and they figure out where they're going to lunch, and then they go live their life. Not everybody, but a lot of people just exactly like they lived it before they ever started coming to church. So there are people in traditional churches that might look on at that and say, oh, wow, that's just so non-effective. Yeah, they got big crowds, but whatever. And my point is just simply this: both extremes have dangers. And I think there are people, and I've been in those churches. I've been a part of a church, and right now I have a very good friend that's pastoring a church that would certainly be labeled as traditional, but it's one of the most effective churches that I've seen in recent history, and that's Pastor Moffat in French Lick, Indiana. But I would, it's a pretty traditional church, and there's no apology for that, and they've been really effective. The churches that I'm talking about are the churches that are clearly dying and clearly haven't seen a new person come to Christ in decades or years, and yet they are, with some tenaciousness, hanging on to whatever they've known. And to me, that's just as bad and just as weak, and produces the same kind of weak Christians. There was a church here in the town that I'm in, which happens to be the town that I last pastored in, and we took over a small church, and literally it had been held open by years for second and third generation people that honestly I don't think had much faith. They're just keeping it open in the memory of their grandma or mom or dad. Mm-hmm. And when we took it over, they were like so thankful to hand over the keys, and we never saw them again. They didn't even want to talk about it. They were just like, oh, we've turned the museum over to somebody else. And so it's like, it's just really hard in these days if you're not in the Word of God, and if you're not taking that in on a regular basis. And I'm not talking about devotions. I'm not talking about the old tired conversation of, do you pray enough? Do you read the Bible enough? Right. In these days, it shouldn't even be a message that you have to have. We should be devouring the Word of God just based on what's going on in the culture around us. Yeah. I mean, He is our only hope.
Yeah. Well, I know that back to the subject a bit, but trials, they're expected in our lives, that's for sure. And so much of what happens is how we respond in those moments, right? And you kind of talked about that because you said point 2 is that truth is exposed.
Whatever's in you is going to come out.
Yeah. So, and that is so true. But talk about that for a moment, because just recap a little bit from what you were saying in the message.
Well, I feel like it's what you've invested in your life, in your personal self, in your heart, in your soul, in your mind, is who you are. Mm-hmm. And that's who you're going to be. That's who's going to get judged at the judgment before God, is not how many accolades you had here, how many toys you had here, how many acres you owned here, how expensive your cars were, or your house is, or how many degrees you had behind your name, or how much money you made. None of that matters. Mm-hmm. And we know that because when you die, you leave everything behind.
But yet, our human tendency is to look at those very things you just mentioned for how well we're doing. Don't you agree?
Well, it's the same thing. It's the same thing with churches that judge their success by nickels and noses.
Yeah.
How many nickels are we raising, and how many noses do we have?
Yeah.
And that's what the church for decades, if not century or more, has from a denominational perspective. That's all they've ever celebrated or tested. So it sends a bad message. But
and that's again
back to this. To what comes out is there's an illustration in this message that I didn't give for the sake of time, and I'll give it to you right now. I mean, you've probably heard it. Baptist pastor R.G. Lee, who was mid-century of last year, pretty effective author of books, wrote a story about visiting two different parishioners on one cold winter day. And the first was a extremely wealthy matriarch of a family, huge home, servants opening the door, or employees, whatever you want to call them. And they had pledged as a family some ridiculous amount of money for the big expensive stained glass window that was going to be put in this church, the biggest gift they were going to have. And they never came through with it. So finally he went to sit in front of this elderly lady, and the house was, he sat before a fire, and she shuffled in, and she knew why he was there, and she didn't want to deal with it. And she started wringing her hands and talking about how hard life had been, and things weren't just going. And she was living in the lap of luxury, just had wealth. That stained glass window wouldn't have set her back a bit, and he knew it.
Yeah,
he kind of just couldn't wait to get out of there. And the next call that he made was a lady that lived by herself in a not so very nice section of town. Screen door hanging crooked off the door, just no money, just living in poverty, but a woman who loved God and experienced God every day and lived and breathed the presence of Jesus. Mm-hmm. And when he came up on the porch, before he could knock, he heard her in there singing an old hymn, and it was these words: "Earthly friends may prove untrue, doubts and fears assail. One still loves and cares for you. Jesus never fails." Jesus never fails. Wow. Heaven and earth may pass away, but Jesus never fails. And so he knocked, and it was just one of those very special moments. And then she said, "Pastor, you'll never believe what happened today." She was heating her home by coal. True story. Her face was glowing. She told him of being out of coal that morning, and the coal delivery man, who was not supposed to come there, she had no money to pay for it, he knocked on her door and said, "I have a partial load and I need to get rid of it. Can I just dump it in your coal bin?" And of course, she had been in touch with Jesus all day, and she was singing "Jesus Never Failed." Wow. And I think the contrast of those two people is, for me, what's in you is going to come out.
Yeah. And so your last point in the message was that it's transformational. And the transformation is to excellence. Mm-hmm. And would it be easy to look at that first lady and say, boy, that's what excellence looks like.
Right. Oh yeah. The big mansion. And
yeah. When what you're really talking about when it comes to excellence is something very different than that. So just let's wrap up talking about that for a moment. What is the excellence that you're talking about?
Well, so again, in the context of my sharing this message, it was knowing full well. And again, I'm trying very hard to walk a really tight line between being an alarmist and somebody that's just sensational and trying to scare people to death. Because again, I've seen that happen in my own lifetime.
Yeah.
But there's also a lot of evidence around that. There's a lot of negativity. There's a lot of hatred toward Christians. We're in a weird time.
Yeah.
And so be prepared for that. Well, James said, don't try to get out of anything prematurely. Let it do its work so you become mature, well-developed, not deficient in any way. Well, the only way I know to do that is to just let God be God. Mm-hmm. And not try to run. Now, it doesn't mean that when something tragic happens that we just go into a period of rejoicing and, that's not it's not reality. It's not, but there is something inside of us because of our relationship with Christ that makes us unique and different. And if that relationship is intact and that relationship is vibrant, we handle it differently. Mm-hmm. And history has shown this. So let's go to the hard word of persecution. Not that I'm saying that's going to happen here necessarily, but if you read the stories, not just old stories, I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds of those. But if you read even the new stories of people in the last year that have had to stand in front of an executioner and be some cases not even given the opportunity to deny their faith. Mm-hmm. In many cases, they lost their head. Or were killed. There's something about it, and I don't like this part of it because I would rather us all just kind of keep holding hands and singing our praise songs and get to heaven the easiest way possible. But there's also something that draws people, just like when Christ was lifted up on the cross, when his people suffer well and suffer with a holy life and with dignity and with purity and with love and charity and kindness, there's something that draws other people to that.
Yeah.
And again, I don't know what we'll face. It may be just a personal thing that you go through. The older I get, the more I walk through life with people, and you get some good days, you get some great days, and then something can change overnight, and you got to deal with something. It may have a good ending, it may not have a not so good ending. But it's just about, again, I go back to that word alignment, and that's where I'm living. I'm just like, it's so hard, Don, because I've been in church all my life, and I've had my great moments, and I've had some not so good moments, but all that's passed, and now I'm just saying, how in the world do I align myself to the Word of God on a daily basis and live this out? That's the most important thing to me.
Yeah. And just before we finish up here, I was just thinking while you were speaking about that, there's a little bit of a tension that I feel personally, which is this, as it relates to, and persecution is not the right word, because we are certainly not being persecuted here, even with all the stuff that's going on in America today. It's just not that. But on the other hand, this is the tension that I feel, because I hear this even from others. They'll say, you know what, God's got this, and let's just put our faith and our trust in Him. But what the takeaway feels like to that is, so just ignore what's going on in the world and just put your trust in Him. I know that really does sound right, but do we just ignore everything and just go on without having some knowledge?
So let me just say this, and you know enough about my own situation. So there are mental health issues that people have to watch out for. And so again, I've been a news hound all my life, but not anymore. Mm-hmm. And I purposefully, for the last several years, have just decreased and decreased and decreased. And then it took a really sharp decrease in the last 6 months. I don't watch the news. I get it. I pick it up here and there, but I can't do it emotionally right now. And I just, part of that goes back to my upbringing. Part of that goes back to the scary sermons and all this. So yeah, I probably have my head in the ground a little bit, but I think this is what probably of that statement, that God's got this. Let me remind you of some people that probably could have said God's got this. John the Baptist. God's got this, and he lost his head. And God did have it, and it was all within the will of God. Yeah. Stephen did nothing but preach an incredible message. Yeah. And God's got this. Yeah, he did. Yeah. He stood. He saw Jesus standing at the right hand of the Father as he did. He modeled Jesus. He said, "Father, forgive them."
It may be that when we say God's got this, we're not sure what that really means.
Yeah. Somebody said, "Just trust Jesus." I'm like, "Have you read the Bible?"
Yeah.
I trust Him, and I do try, and I know He saves, and I know He can deliver. But he did that for Daniel, and He did that. But it's not just a given.
Right.
It's not. And around the world, there are men and women who are great people of faith, whose names will never get mentioned anywhere in our Western world, who daily people are dying for their faith. Yeah. And again, I don't have that death wish, but I want to be ready for whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. That's challenging stuff right there. But I guess we'll wrap it up and look forward to next week. Yeah, whatever it is that you're going to be talking about.
Keep marching forward. I'm going to try to be encouraging next week,
Okay. Hey, thanks so much. Have a good day.
All right. Thanks, Don.
Thanks for watching. Take a moment to share with your friends.